Kirk Cousins gave us a window into how Kevin O'Connell is trying to coach him up, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. So we're keeping on with camp. It was the second day of camp on Thursday, so we'll go over some of the notes for that. I also want to talk to you a little bit about fake stories or BS stories, or if you've gotten the wrong narrative. We're gonna learn as a family, all right, together, how to suss out what is true and what is hyped up nonsense. But before we get into all that, I think the most important thing that I want to dive into is this quote from Kirk Cousins about Kevin O'Connell and the coaching relationship they have. And there's a lot to say on this, but first let me just read you the quote. So he's asked about the way that O'Connell is coaching him and changing his processing and stuff. And he tells one example. He says, I remember a concept we had in OTAs in practice. I said no to a route over here and threw a route over here. And afterwards, O'Connell said, hey, I want you to take that with that look. Don't progress. And prior to him saying that, I would have progressed every time. So I said, okay. And we probably ran that play half a dozen times again in the spring. And when we got that look, I was just going to take that first option. It's important to understand what he wants and not just play to, well, I've done this before, so I'll just do this again. It's more of a, how do you want it to look? Let me execute that way. But that takes time to learn. Okay, so let's break that down, right? Kirk Cousins had one idea of how a play should go, and Kevin O'Connell says, I think you should start doing it this way. And in a follow-up answer, he said, it was just a change in philosophy. It's not like if you look at a quarterback decision and go back and listen to the quarterback decision podcast I did a couple weeks ago, what's in a QB's decision, there's a lot that goes into it, and a lot of it's subjective. There's a lot that can be argued, was this or wasn't this the right decision? And some of it's just philosophy. So I want to draw up an example of what this could be, or the kind of thing this could mean, and why I'm genuinely really, really excited about that quote. I think that is really meaningful toward a Kirk Cousins improvement. And this is what Kevin O'Connell sold us on, right? So look, it is late July. Let's sell ourselves on Kevin O'Connell actually dialing in Kirk Cousins' process in a way that can affect meaningful change in the way that Kirk Cousins plays for very much the better. So if you're on YouTube, you're looking at a little play design. If you're listening, I'll do my best to be descriptive, but I do recommend that if you can, you go watch this part with the visual aid. But I want to draw up just a little play concept. It's called Smash. It's pretty standard and universal. You have the outside receiver run a little curl route, and then you have an inside receiver like a slot receiver, call it KJ Osborne, would run a corner route. And the idea is to put the cornerback on the outside in conflict. If he comes up and covers the curl route, you have a lot of room over the top in the corner. And if he goes and backs off and he covers the deep route, you should have a really wide open little button hook. So this is a place where I can see that exact conversation coming into play, because let's say Kirk Cousins thinks that if that corner is playing off coverage, if he's playing really deep, well, he'll be in better position to cover that deep corner route, and I'm going to throw the button hook every time. And maybe that's his first read, right? You read it outside in or right to left or whatever. Now, let's say that cornerback is playing off coverage and maybe even with some outside leverage. Maybe he's cheating toward the sideline a little bit. And the wide receiver is going to turn his button hook toward the inside, so he has even more room. Kirk Cousins definitely wants to throw that. But consider this. Kevin O'Connell might want Kirk Cousins to move off of that, even though it's a really good look, just because it's only a 5-yard button hook, and he wants Kirk Cousins to check that corner route first to make sure that there might not be something really cool there. Because what you'll usually have in a lot of defenses, if one corner is playing off coverage, a lot of times that means that the nickel corner, or if there's any other D-backs on that side of the field, are going to be playing really far up. And defenses will do that because you could have something like a flat route or some kind of swing pass from the running back or something that could be a big problem, and you need some defender up here to really be able to handle that, or at least starting there if it's a bubble screen or something like that. But so you'll have like a slot corner really close to the line of scrimmage. And if that slot corner is in press coverage, well, what if that slot wide receiver is Justin Jefferson, who is fantastic at beating slot corners in press? It's like the most productive thing he does is do that and win on like slot fades. So if that's happening, and let's say even the cornerback or the slot cornerback is cheating inside, well, you've got an outbreaking route, and now that slot corner's in the wrong leverage and in press. I kind of don't care what this other cornerback does. This is a really, really good situation, especially if the defense is in a single high look, which means one single high safety in the middle of the field who's going to have a long way to go if he's going to take that corner route. So you've got this really good opportunity for Justin Jefferson to go beat somebody on a corner route, and Kirk Cousins might not throw it because the look says that the button hook is good and that he's going to throw the button hook, and Kevin O'Connell might say, hey, I know that button hook looks really good, and throwing it over the top and throwing it past this corner might be difficult, but I want you to do it, and that's why I like that look. And explaining those things in those terms, in those quarterbacky terms, if that gets through and really works for Kirk Cousins, that could change some of the more autopilot-y reads and decisions that he makes that have bothered me so much. This could be really awesome. Now, I don't know if that's at all close to what they were talking about or if that was the actual subject or whatever. It could have been a bunch of things. That's just one example of the kind of conversation that can be. And I think what's important to understand about it is that both throws in that situation would be defensible. The button hook, if it's an easy completion, is really hard to argue against, but obviously going for the corner route is a perfectly reasonable thing to do as well, and maybe Kevin O'Connell just wants him to do that if he sees, the receiver has the advantage that I want. Both of those things are reasonable options, and that's why Cousins said it's a philosophical thing. It's learning the coach's philosophy and what he wants me to do. But here's what I think excites me about this. Obviously, Mike Zimmer couldn't coach up Kirk Cousins. A failure of his was to coach Kirk Cousins to stop doing things that hurt the offense, right? And a lot of that's on Kirk, but some of that too has to be on the coach who couldn't coach it out of him. And I think part of that too is, Mike Zimmer had notes for Kirk Cousins, even though, he got super aloof down the stretch. There was still, it was public, right? I told him I want him to throw that one, the infamous throws in the Packers game last year that the Vikings won, and they won it in large part because Kirk Cousins made some really aggressive throws that were pretty risky, but he nailed them, and that moved the offense enough, and they won a close game. And then after the game, Mike Zimmer said, he was really nervous about those throws, but I told him, hey, it's totally fine. If you get picked, you get picked. I want you to keep doing those aggressive throws. A fine note, but listen to the language there. It's, keep making risky throws. Well, what the hell does that mean? Do I do it? How risky is too risky? If the corner is a yard away, 2 yards away, what if he's playing 3 yards over the top, but I think he can come in if I don't lead it right? And is that a risky throw? Like where should the safety be? What is a risky throw? Whereas this conversation is a lot more granular, and it's a lot more about, hey, when the look is particularly like this, when the slot corner's on the inside and the outside corner's playing off, I want you to change the way that you read this. And it's very much, it's talking to a quarterback in a quarterback's language. And again, this was the thesis of hiring Kevin O'Connell, so you shouldn't be surprised about it. But it's cool to see it play out in that way. I want to get to the rest of camp, and I want to talk about fake news some. But first, let me talk to you about a good old Gramble. If you believe in this, if you believe in Kevin O'Connell and the Vikings, why don't you Gramble on it? They got over/under 8.5 wins at BetOnline. If you think they can have a winning record this year, I'm not even talking playoffs. I'm just talking winning record. You can go Gramble on it, and I'm pretty sure that's better than 2-1 odds for you. So go do it. Or if you do think they'll make the playoffs, that's even better. Go Gramble on that, or where they'll place in the division, or any number of things. You can bet on MLB or WNBA. You can bet on futures like MVP and stuff. You can bet on all sorts of stuff. That is at betonline.ag. betonline.net. You can also bet on like player props and build weird parlays. You can bet right in the middle of a game or an event with their live betting module. It's awesome. That is once again betonline.net, where the game starts. Hey, so two projects that I want to let you all know about here at Locked On. The first one is the Minnesota Football Party, which is going to be a little ensemble show twice a week about the Minnesota Vikings with me, Arif Hassan, Luke Inman, and Sam Ekstrom. It's going to be a really good time. The second one is not a Locked On project. It's just a personal one for me. It's an independent thing. It is the history of the Minnesota Vikings. If you subscribe to me on Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL, the link will be in the description on YouTube or the show notes on the podcast. If you subscribe to me, you can watch episode 1 of the history of the Minnesota Vikings right now. It's about 34 minutes long, and you can go check it out. If you don't want to subscribe to me on Patreon, no worries. It's going to be out on Saturday. You just got to wait an extra day. So if you want some early access, come join me. I would love it if you join me on Patreon, but if not, no pressure. Anyways, let's talk about camp. So what else is going on? Kirk Cousins has looked pretty sharp in camp. It's hard, it's shorts. There's not a lot of pads. There's not a lot you can glean, but people seem to be pretty happy with him. The coach seems happy with how he's gotten the playbook and stuff. That's all fine. The stars of camp are sort of who you'd expect. Oh, yeah, Irv Smith looks good. Justin Jefferson looks good. Danielle Hunter looks good. All that is kind of what you would expect. Adam Thielen looks good. That's all what you would expect. The real headline's probably Andrew Booth still. He had that really cool interception day 1 that we talked about yesterday, but he kept playing pretty well, including some jawing back and forth. That was sort of the fun moment of camp on day 2. Andrew Booth and Amir Smith-Marset start jawing and getting into it, and Booth seems like he's just like ready to pick a fist fight with anyone at all times. That was like the first thing that jumped out off of his tape to me. Like in actual games, he looks like he's going to find you out in the parking lot later and pick a fight with you and settle this like men. And that is carrying over to camp. And I love that. That is like exactly what I want in a corner. I answered, somebody asked me about him on Twitter, and I said, like, he is the exact kind of divorced from reality that you want in a cornerback, because a lot of cornerback play requires sort of unearned confidence. Like, it requires confidence whether you've earned that confidence or not. Like, if you get beat, you have to still jump. Like, if you get double moved, you jump a route and you were wrong, the next time you're jumping a route, you have to do it with just as much authority. If you start being hesitant or not doing it with authority, you lose that confidence. You're going to get burned a ton by receivers that are going to start preying on that. This is exactly what happened to Bashaud Breeland and Cameron Dantzler last year. And Andrew Booth seems to have this unshakable confidence where you can get beat 4 times on a rep and still play with exactly as much tenacity as you need to. I think that is a requisite trait of any good cornerback. You're going to lose some reps. You've got to be able to keep your confidence up. I love that Booth seems to have that. Lewis Seen has had some ups and downs. Mostly I'm getting this from Arif Hassan at The Athletic, who wrote a little bit about Seen the first day, where he's taking some bad angles and he's having a little bit of hesitation. And look, first day, of course, right? You're still getting to learn the reads and stuff. And it seems like he's going to the right place and he's just a little bit slow to do it. For day 1 of camp, that's a fine place for a rookie to be. You just got to get a little more confidence in it, get a little faster at it, get a little more used to it and acclimated. And that's the kind of thing you might see him start to make more plays as we get closer to actual preseason play, which would be pretty cool. Other odds and ends. I keep hearing about Myron Mitchell. He keeps doing really well. I mean, Mitchell's a deep, deep sleeper, but this is the kind of fun thing of camp where, somebody starts excelling on the third team. You go, oh, this guy might actually find a way to sneak onto the roster. Why not? He was an undrafted guy last year out of UAB, I think, and he, I think, missed a whole bunch of camp with an injury or COVID or something like that. And didn't make the team, but he was on the practice squad. He's trying again. So that's a guy to keep an eye out. I should mention Cameron Dantzler also has been having a fairly strong camp. Andrew Booth has been the fun guy to watch, but Cameron Dantzler has not relinquished his spot on the ones. We have not seen any depth chart movement. We don't have, well, there's one, and I'll get to it in a sec, but we haven't seen anything of like first, second team swaps. Cameron Dantzler still with the first team. Cam Bynum still with the first team. The rookies are all still with the second team. Jesse Davis still playing at guard. The only change we saw from day 1 to day 2 was at backup quarterback. In day 1, Kellen Mond and Sean Mannion were splitting reps with the second team. Day 2 was all Mannion with the second team. There's a lot of different things that could mean, right? That could just be a rotational thing they're going to do. And then, on Saturday, Kellen Mond gets all of the reps with the second team, which would be pretty fun because that's the night practice that a whole bunch of fans should be at. So that could happen. Or it could just be that Mannion is going to get the second team reps, and now Kellen Mond has to take the second team reps back from him. Or it could be that Mannion does a few practices, then they give Mond a few practices, then they rotate for a few. I don't know what their plan is, but it's something to monitor. Obviously, I think we're all rooting for Kellen Mond to take that backup job and be the backup quarterback he was drafted to be. In terms of the other position battles, especially in the trenches, it's really hard. They haven't put pads on yet, so if somebody beats somebody else around the edge for a sack, it's like, well, you couldn't really put your hands on him, and you couldn't really put your weight into him, and you're not really pushing on each other the way you normally would, and you're sort of still going through the motions, and it's a ramp-up period. Kevin O'Connell talked about this in his press conference earlier on Thursday, that it's they aren't going for the full length yet, which is an NFL thing. They're having the first practices of camp are shorter, so you kind of ramp up, and that's supposed to be better for you. And so they're still in the ramp up thing. They're still not going 100%. And any conclusion that we have yet, I mean, it's, there's 57 minutes left in the game, right? And maybe somebody's up 3-0, but there's a lot left to be played in all those position battles. So instead, let's go over, I guess, what turned out to be a couple of the bigger stories floating around were about, we talked on, what was it, Monday or Wednesday, about Kwesi kind of putting his foot in his mouth when he said some stuff about Kirk Cousins he probably shouldn't have. Now we've got a similar thing with Justin Jefferson who said something that people have taken way out of context and tried to make it some sort of beef within the team, and it's not that way at all, and let's just clear that air. So moving right along with that conversation, in an article written by Chris Thomason at the Pioneer Press, it was an article about Kirk Cousins getting used to the new playbook and his off-season workload and how he studied the playbook and stuff. And the title of this article is Kirk Cousins arrived for camp in good shape and comfortable with the playbook. Great, right? That's what we expected, and that's not the only positive thing about Kirk in camp. It seems like he's slinging it pretty good right now. But of course, new playbook, getting stuff together, and there's quotes from Kevin O'Connell about how impressed he was that, Cousins was starting to finish his sentences in QB rooms and stuff. And so Cousins is getting to know it and doing the study thing. That's like Kirk Cousins' world, right? Is the homework room. He's still got all his bins of notebooks. You could probably ask him about a throw he made at Michigan State, and I bet he'd have notes about it. Great. Love it. That's awesome. In that article, there is a quote from Justin Jefferson. Apparently a bunch of the wide receivers went to work out in South Florida. They invited Kirk Cousins, and he didn't come because he wanted to be with his family, which is like, all right, sure, yeah, that's fine. Nobody cared about it. Justin Jefferson was like, yeah, that's fine. He's a family guy. We'll work out with him later. Pretty innocuous stuff. Then the apparatus takes over, and you're going to start hearing about this on Shock Jock Radio. So I'm going to, again, just read the full quotes to you, and then we'll talk about them, right? We're going to hear the whole thing. Quote, he's a family guy, so he likes to be with his family in the offseason and stuff, Jefferson said Thursday. I don't blame him. So during that time, us receivers just got together. That was followed up by a quote from Cousins himself about how he worked in the offseason and how he can throw to just stationary people, if there's just a high school kid or just a cousin or something. No pun intended. He can just kind of throw to stationary people and just sort of mentally rep progressions and stuff, and he can get a lot of work in that way. And then Jefferson went on to say, yeah, Cousins really is looking sharp, and he knows the playbook, and that's really great and all that. It was a very positive article. But that quote that I just read you, Thomason tweeted out a series of quotes. That was one of them. And I think Thomason has a bit of a habit of tweeting, of kind of carving out the incendiary part of the quote and then tweeting that out without any context and instead just one of a bunch that he just throws out, right? And then a lot of people said something about how, Kirk Cousins didn't go throw with his wide receivers. Well, he's not a team player. He's not a leader. Oh, no. And it's a reach, I will go with, because if you read the article and actually look at any information at all, it is very clear that nobody has a problem with this. And Kirk Cousins worked out with his wide receivers, not Jefferson specifically, who was, I think, working with somebody else at the time, but he went with Thielen and Osborne and I think a couple other people earlier in the offseason. So, like, he has done that. He just didn't go to that trip because he wanted to be with family. So, few things about this. A, players can be with their family in the offseason if you expect them to abandon their family, which in the replies to those tweets, there were people that were like, he's had enough family time, which is just utterly insane. Like, let the dude be with his family. Two, Kirk Cousins, for him, work-life balance is a very important thing. And I think he's absolutely in the right on that. Like Tuesdays in season, that is the player's off day. He uses that to be with his family. And he was like, I will not work on an off day. And he actually defends it too by saying, like, that's also a mental health, like a mental rest day. I don't want to burn out my brain, trying to work so hard that I'm like tired and I'm not sharp on game day. Tuesday is very important as a rest day, which is also like a really good point. And, unless you're doing like philanthropy or something, you should probably use the off day as the off day it's intended to be. But beyond this, can you see the pattern here and how this always happens? There's always going to be some quote, and a lot of times, that quote will be somebody will, whether it's the reporter of the article itself just tweeting out a bunch of quotes and that's one of them, or whether it's somebody else who's genuinely just trying to get a really engagement-y tweet. I'm not innocent. Sometimes I'll do that, but just to mess with people. But whatever it is, that quote will be out of context, and then people will look at just the out of context part, and then that becomes the whole story. You would be forgiven if all you saw was, if you went online, or if you're probably going to hear it on the radio, and you thought that there was some argument that had happened between Justin Jefferson and Kirk Cousins about working out in South Florida. There was not. In fact, the exact opposite. They have worked together before, and now they're in camp, and they're all working together great, and everything is hunky-dory. So how do we avoid this, right? How do you and I, we can't control what people who just want to get a lot of engagement online, or a good headline, or good clickbait, or a good radio site, we can't control what those people do, right? But we can control, you and I, dear listener, we can control how we react to things, right? So how do you tell the difference between a taken out of context clickbait quote and something that's actually the story? The easy answer, read the freaking article, right? Go actually read it. And we talked about this before. Go read what the person meant, not what the person said, because words are weird and you can carve things out and take little sentences out of context to make it look like somebody said something that they absolutely did not. And that's exactly what's happening here. If all you saw was, he's a family guy, so he likes to be with his family in the offseason. So during that time, us receivers just got together, accompanied with the context of Kirk Cousins didn't go work out with his wide receivers and instead went with his family. You might think that might have been a story with some negative connotation, when in reality, the actual article itself is this series of glowing quotes about how sharp and prepared Kirk Cousins is for camp. So that's the first thing. If it seems like a sentence fragment, or it seems like just sort of one little fact, you might want to go check if that's the whole story, or if there's maybe more to it than that. You can kind of tell when a quote is not the full sentence, just like the way people talk. Sometimes it sounds funny, and keep an eye out for that. And also, always just look for as much context as you can and look for the whole article, right? And just read the whole freaking thing and just know what the guy meant, and not just the words that he said that can be warped. But also, a lot of times, look for if there are actual words quoted. Around the NFL did this, and they deleted it and then reposted it with something better, so good for them. But the Around the NFL Twitter account posted about the Kwesi quote about Kirk Cousins isn't Patrick Mahomes, and we have to build our team kind of understanding that, and said something really incendiary. I forget what the actual wording was because the tweet's deleted now, but it was something like, Kwesi has regrets about Kirk Cousins, or something insane like that. It's this huge reach, but you can tell in that tweet that was just the tweet that they used to plug an article that obviously had the information a lot more responsibly laid out, but it was just the social post. There were no quotation marks. That's not anything he said. And so now you are trusting the social media person's interpretation of what that guy said. Is that what you're going to place your trust in? That's where I think we can do this. Understand who you're listening to. Are you listening to a journalist's, a reporter's interpretation of an event? And would you rather trust that interpretation or go into the quotes that they have given you and interpret them yourself? That's what we want to do. This extends beyond sports. These are skills we should all have. All right. Fake news is everywhere. So go check on that. And by the way, check for fake accounts. They're everywhere. If you're on Twitter, don't just like blindly share stuff because it might not be real, y'all. And I've seen a lot of you get got so far. So a lot of people showed up in my DMs asking if this or that was fake, and all of it was. So be careful. Head on a swivel out there. Tomorrow's a night practice. I hope everybody enjoys that. Tomorrow is also, if you're not a patron, you can see the first episode of the history doc tomorrow. If you are a patron, you can already see it. So get hyped for that. And I will see you all on Monday. We'll talk about what's next with camp, what's going on. It's that time. I'm sure we'll have all sorts of stuff to discuss. I will see you all then. And as always, Skull.